and you're going to sit there awkwardly while I do that, and then we'll get started. Here we go. Hey, it's working. Cool. No, now you can stop working. Okay. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to mattnews.biz, the podcast where I share and discuss contrary thoughts, opinions, and beliefs that have been lovingly dubbed Matt News in my circle of influence. All right. So this episode is brought to you unofficially by Restream. Restream is the best way to live stream to YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, and 30 plus streaming sites all at once. You can expand your audience with multi-streaming today at restream.io. Now, I want to give a disclaimer really quick with episode 32. So I had John the Messenger on. That episode is being delayed because of technical issues and difficulties I was having, and I want to apologize to John. Again, he's at John the Messenger on TikTok. But once these issues are fixed, I'm going to do some post-processing and stuff. I'm going to release that on YouTube, and I'm going to release it to my podcast providers as well. Now, as of tonight's episode, tonight is episode 33. What I want you to do is I want you to feel free to interact with me and my guest tonight during the live stream. Whether you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or even Twitch, you can connect in the chat section and we will see it, and we'll reserve a time at the end to respond back to you. Now, tonight, we're talking about the Bible again, which I'm so thankful that I'm getting back to. But more importantly, we're going to talk about context. Why is it important to understand the context of the Bible, and is misunderstanding the Bible, the context, destroying the church? Tonight, I have Bradley Vazquez with Altarnate Media to talk with me. Hey, how is it going, Brad?
It's pretty good, man. I'm thrilled to be here, honestly. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, man, you reached the big times of about 3 people watching.
Hey, any audience is a good audience, right?
That's right, man. Now, Brad or Bradley, or do you want me to call you Altarnate Media, Brad?
Bradley, either one is fine.
All right. So, like I was telling you in our kind of pre-show, I don't have any whiskey for you, but you said you have some.
I do. Yes.
I don't drink, so.
Hey, to each their own. I respect that decision.
Yeah, man. Yeah. So you were recently banned on TikTok.
I was, yes.
So that's how I came across your videos. I'm sure a lot of people have come across your videos on TikTok. Just especially if you're on Christian TikTok, I feel like TikTok's algorithms are a lot better at showing you what you really want to watch.
Absolutely.
It's way better than Facebook is right now, and Instagram and all like that. But so TikTok, I ran across your videos. I find them very informative, especially with somebody like me who I'm kind of like dipping my toe into Hebrew, and so I'm learning it. And I know the Hebrew alphabet, and I can also I can read it really slow. I sound like a kindergartner, but I can read Hebrew.
Yep, that's the way it starts, man.
Yeah. So, but again, TikTok, you were banned.
Yes.
Wow.
Well, my best guess would be because I did a video responding to one of the trends that I saw on TikTok. On TikTok there are those trends where people just paste the same audio to their own videos and so on and so forth. It just keeps going. So there was a particular trend speaking about how the Bible doesn't have the word homosexual in it. It's this theory based on the 1946 project and the mistranslation, quote unquote, of the RSV Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So it just, I'd seen it so many times. It just got to a point where it's like, okay, I have to respond to this. So I did an entire video on Leviticus 18:22, kind of going into the actual Hebrew words of the text and how it reads. And I got a lot of hate from the LGBTQ community.
I bet you did. And what was surprising is that that person found it surprising that you were locked in on Leviticus 18:22, but it's scripture.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of, as we're talking about the Bible, and I think I think a lot of the controversy centers around verses in the New Testament, particularly with their premise.
Mhm.
But for me personally, I always try and start from the earliest reference possible because that sets the precedence.
Right.
So whether or not the New Testament has the word in there, the New Testament's in Greek, that's a whole other ball of wax. But
Mhm.
if the Bible maintains consistency, then Leviticus 18:22 would set the precedence on how we're to understand it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I asked you this question before we started, and then you didn't have time to answer me then. So now you can answer me. So, would you consider yourself a Christian, or because I guess you consider yourself a Messianic Jew, but does that exclude you from Christianity? Um, how would you label yourself?
It's I told you before we came on, it's a complex question to answer, namely because there are divisions even within Christendom
Mhm.
on what actually classifies somebody as a Christian and what doesn't. So typically, I don't identify as a Christian. I do believe that Jesus was the Messiah. So if your prerequisite for what is a Christian is solely based on that, the acceptance of Jesus and his sacrifice, then absolutely, I would say that I'm a Christian by those standards. But if your prerequisite for Christianity leads into other doctrinal points of contention, then that's where I may say that my thoughts kind of lead me to another nomenclature.
Yeah, yeah. So, what are some of those? What are some of those doctrinal contentions?
So one of them being a lot of Christianity is predicated on the idea that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the commandments are. I don't want to say nullified. I don't think anybody would say the word nullified, but more or less that it's inapplicable for a believer today, which I would tend to disagree with. And I've got my own reasonings for that, which if you'd like, we can get into later. But one of the other ones I would say, I honor the seventh day Sabbath rather than Sunday. I don't celebrate any of the Christian holidays, but I do celebrate the biblical holidays, Passover, Sukkot, whatnot. And this one always somehow comes up, so I'll go ahead and head it off before the question comes about. But I am not a Trinitarian.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that's a weird one. I want to write that down. So maybe I'll circle back to it. Maybe not. But I want to talk about a little bit about your kind of your YouTube page, or I guess kind of the media thing that you're doing right now, which is Altarnate Media, which you spell altar as an altar, like a biblical altar.
Yeah.
So Altarnate Media, what is it, and kind of what's the goal of it?
So me and my colleague Seamus, that if you look at our videos, you've seen a couple of them.
Mm-hmm.
He and I have kind of grown up in the faith together a little bit. I haven't known him for my whole life, but I've known him since pretty much senior year of high school. So we developed in our faith together, and in a lot of what we've learned, especially him after attending Liberty University.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of what we have learned that a lot of Christianity is not exposed to. And a lot of contextual points directly from Judaism that actually do lend a good perspective on even the New Testament, just because it's idioms, terms of phrase, things like that. If you're not already familiar with the culture and the history of the time, then it's going to go over your head when you read it. If you don't know what you're supposed to be looking for, you'll never find it. So the goal is really to kind of, for Altarnate Media specifically, is to make that information available for anybody who's curious to learn it. Our big series that we're working on right now is Killing the Church, which is it's a double entendre. The name is intended for shock and awe, right? Because it's our idea is really to draw both audiences. Obviously, the idea of sharing the gospel to the lost. I like the idea of having a title that would appeal to atheists, but at the same time, I like having a title that would influence Christians enough to like click on it and see what we're saying.
Right.
The double entendre of the name, though, is really that there are certain things, practices, doctrines that have been longstanding in Christianity, but are not biblical, strictly speaking. And so those are the things we aim to kill, and that kind of shows the reversal. There are certain things in the church that need to be killed, and those things happen to be things that are themselves subsequently killing the church.
Cool. Yeah. So on your YouTube page, in your introduction, Seamus kind of says that you guys have 30 years of scholarship between the two of you.
Yes.
So what's your personal educational background?
My personal educational background is really it's a lot of home study. I grew up with probably one of the most biblically devout men for a father that I've ever met, and I could not stress that enough to you. And so much so that my dad had me memorizing scripture from the point that I could talk. I don't remember a time in my life where I was not being forced to to memorize verses and then recite them. So growing up in that, growing up with certain curriculums, I mean, I understood the finer points of Southern Baptist doctrine, which is more or less how I grew up. By like the age of 11, I could have a full-on peer-to-peer conversation with an adult about those points. So from that point on, it was really kind of a learning curve into the more Judaic side of theology. So that's kind of where my upbringing has been. Is that's where me and my dad have met. Is that one of the main things we have in common is our interest in theology. So for me, it's not so much credentialed. I fancy myself as kind of a theological Goodwill Hunting.
That's a good way to put it.
But for Seamus, very specifically, he has since I've known him, he's interned under youth pastors, and then again spent his time at Liberty University studying theology and history, particularly early church history, but history in general.
Cool. So what does your dad think about your theology right now?
Well, he kind of is he's kind of the main reason we've gone into it. So I grew up, in the Baptist church, and my dad always was a well-respected member of the church, kind of right there next to the pastor. You'd have the people who said, well, I wonder what the pastor thinks about this passage. And then you'd have other people who were like, well, I wonder what Brad's dad says about this passage, and that's kind of how any church we've ever been to, that was how the crowd divided, is like, some actually did respect my dad a little more than the pastor, and that became an issue at certain churches. So, but that being what it is, my dad is actually the first one who went down this path. Being a Sunday school teacher, he kind of hit that point where it's like, okay, year in, year out, we go through basically the same lessons. They've got a different mask on them. They may feel a little bit different, but like the crux of the matter of what I'm teaching these people is the exact same lesson. So, he kind of got to that point where he felt like he knew everything, and that scared him, because if God is unsearchable, you can't know everything. So he asked God to show him something new, let his Bible fall open, and there was Matthew 5:17-20. And so he actually started down this path first, and I fought him every step of the way. Because, for me, it's like, look, this is the theology you raised me in, and now you're coming at me sideways with something different.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to Matthew 5, but I was going to ask you a little bit about how you came to kind of realize this point of view. We'll just call it a messianic perspective.
Yeah.
But how did you come to the messianic perspective? Was Matthew 5 kind of the opening floodgate?
Not really. Like I said, I actually fought him every step of the way, and it took place in a topical way. So it's
Okay.
kind of just we would argue over specific topical points, and I mean this took place over probably 3 or 4 years, and nights that we would stay up till 3:30 or 4:30 in the morning, Bibles open, yelling at each other. And over a long span of being wrong in so many arguments, I came to a point where I actually was in a dispute with another this was a progressive Christian, and found myself using the same lines of argumentation that my dad was using against me. And that's where it was like, oh, maybe that's valid.
So what was one of the first topics that you guys discussed that kind of brought that contention to you?
The dietary issue, actually.
Okay.
That's probably the bigger one. The two big ones that you're going to get, it really are always going to be like, the Saturday Sabbath versus Sunday, and the dietary laws. Those are like the two big things that people typically will argue about. And so the dietary ones, I think this is like the first one that I remember, having big contentions with him on.
Mm-hmm. So well, your point of view now too, is it that we should keep the dietary laws?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'd have to come back to you on that one too, because I'm not really prepared to have the conversation.
Absolutely.
But let's talk about this messianic perspective. What do you see as kind of the primary context of the Bible? Or do you see them as, do you have a primary context and then they kind of break up into sub contexts?
So probably the primary context of the Bible, I would say, is, I guess, are you asking like literal versus mystical versus,
No. I'm more asking because I've come to this perspective that we read the Bible a lot of times with Western eyes, and the Bible, the context of the Bible this is an ancient Near Eastern document.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So my answer to that question then would be, the Bible is a Jewish book written by Jewish people about the Jewish faith and the Jewish God. Well, Jewish God, that's that's probably going a little too far with it, but it's the God that the Jews have recognized throughout history, and the Jewish Messiah, and it's been entirely written by Jews. So I would say the context of the Bible should be understood through the lens of a Semitic Jewish perspective.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with it, and because I believe the exact same thing. Is this is a Jewish book? It's you have to look at it through this Jewish perspective, which is why it's a good idea to go back, like what you're talking about. Go back and look at the original context. Like go back and look at Genesis 1 so that you can understand what John is saying in Revelation.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because when John talks about horns, what is he talking about? Well, where else does it talk about horns in the Bible? That's when you're going to learn about all those different things.
Absolutely.
So what do you mean by when you say Semitic context? What do you mean by that?
I mean very specifically the context of the Judaism that existed in and around the time that the Bible took place. So there's the time before Jesus where there's not a whole lot of Judaism to speak of that's been recorded, at least as far as you're not going to find many documents from that before that period.
Mhm.
It was carried on in an oral tradition. So, whether or not you accept the validity of oral transmission, that's a topic of dispute. I've got my own thoughts on it,
Mhm.
but I do find it for the most part trustworthy,
Mhm.
given the circumstances that it was transmitted under within Judaism. But
Right.
yeah, kind of that Near Eastern first century Jewish perspective. And there's a caveat to that, because the ruler of the Sanhedrin during the time that Jesus was in his ministry, his adulthood, that Judaism actually was a little different from the Judaism that preceded that,
Mhm. Mhm.
and then also has now lived after that. It's that Judaism really only lasted for 7 years, and it's isolated within that time slot.
Okay. Okay. And that period before Jesus, you're talking about kind of that intertestamental period,
Yeah,
like Book of Enoch and Maccabees, that kind of stuff.
absolutely.
Yeah. 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 Have you ever heard of Dr. Michael Heiser?
I have. I get that question a lot, actually.
Because like, I think you would agree on some of the things that he talks about. I want to circle back to when I was talking about context. You asked about mythical or literal. So how do you define the term literal? One, yeah, let's start with that question. How do you define literal?
Okay, so within Judaism, there are many modes of exegesis, but there are 4 primary ones that are all collectively referred to as pardes, which, Judaism is cool. You take, multiple words and just scrunch them into one word to make it easier to say in conversation. But really, it's an acronym that stands for Peshat, Remez, Darush, and Sod. Peshat would be the literal interpretation of the text. That is exactly as it reads. That is how to interpret it. So there are instances where, like the description that we get in the Bible of Lucifer being the king of Tyre, right?
Mhm.
Peshat would actually say that that's not a description of Satan. That is a description of the king of Tyre. Why?
Right.
Because that's what it says. It says the king of Tyre.
Right.
Darush is more like the seeking out. It's like and I may be getting this mixed up with no, yeah, Darush is the almost like reading between the lines. What's it hinting at?
Okay.
And Remez would be the comparative. In other words, this looks a lot like this, or this is worded a lot like this, or this is spelled a lot like this. And so what do these two have in common? So the 2 great commandments, actually, the Jewish sage Hillel was the first one actually to put those two together, based on the idea that they're both beginning with the phrase "and you shall love," ve'ahavta in Hebrew. And so because those two both begin specifically with the phrase "and you shall love," he went, okay, well, those two go together then. And they're, one's in Leviticus, one's in Deuteronomy. There's 2 completely separate parts of the Bible that he joined together because of the way they're phrased. That would be more along the lines of Ramesh. Sod, the mystical. Sod is the deeply mystical, like, man, I don't even know if I could really sum up an interpretation. So
let's take one of the most contended stories in the Bible. Let's just go with Adam and Eve, right?
okay,
There's people that believe that Adam and Eve were 2 literal people who were literally created, and the entire world literally comes from them. How would you view that?
I mean, so obviously literal. I take that very literally.
Okay.
I'm very, very literalist when it comes to Genesis.
Okay.
But there are other mystical interpretations that undergo what that is, and those are not discounted within Judaism. It's awesome. So Peshat always takes precedence. Whatever the literal meaning is, that's what it is. But they don't just chalk all the others to the side because of that. Those are also included and valued for teaching and learning. So the idea that Eve was taken out of Adam. One of the understandings is that meant that Eve existed within Adam prior to being taken out. So she's not really like a creation, but she existed within him. So was Adam a hermaphrodite? Maybe not physically, but he certainly had both the masculine and feminine natures within him prior to the feminine being separated out of him. And that's one of the understandings of that.
Yeah, one understanding I've heard of as well is kind of this how the first 5 books of the Bible were almost a response to other ancient Near Eastern religions as well, and so that's why you see so many similarities, is because the nefesh and all that jazz coming down and spreading false teachings, and so that's where the Torah kind of birthed out of that, combating these false teachings that were inherent in ancient Near East. And so Adam and Eve, there's a Greek myth where you have the first beings had 2 heads, 4 arms, and 4 legs, and then they were ripped apart and they were separated.
Yes.
And so you kind of see those similarities and things like that as well. So actually, I don't know where I was going with that. I guess just you can see parallels and things like that, and so to take a literal or to take something, mystical and figurative. But I don't know, maybe if you had a different example than that.
Some of them it's in like, some of them it's literal in as much as you account for the mystical. One of the most disputed examples in all of the Old Testament I can think of would be like the Nephilim, right? Because nobody can decide whether or not those are the product of angels and humans mating, or if they were the angels that mated with the humans, or what are they?
Right.
Because it's almost mentioned as a side note, and so
that's what I meant, not Nefesh, but Nephilim. That's what I was.
Nephilim. I was going to say Nefesh is the soul, the animal soul. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Nephilim that's one of those where one of the Jewish commentators, Ramban, or you may know him as Nachmanides. A lot of people may know him as Nachmanides. Ramban is like, again, that whole shortening of his name. It's Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, Moshe son of Nachman. So he wrote a commentary in response to Rashi concerning the Torah. So when it comes to the Nephilim, he says the blatant literal reading of that passage is exactly as it's intended to be understood, provided that you take into account the inherent mystical nature of it. That's, that's weird. So the idea that angels came down and mated with human women, okay, that's the literal idea that we get. So how do you mystify that? And that I could go on about that for a long while.
Yeah. Well, see, I love those kind of conversations, like, because I think that I like this Jewish exegesis that you pointed out, because it gives you those different levels of, like, you want to read it in a literal, you want to read it literal, but you also want to make sure you read the subtext that's in it. And so the question I was asking about, how would you define literal, is because, like, I would say I take a literal reading of the Bible, but I read it more literary. Like, it is a piece of Jewish literature that we are to understand, and so not every story is literal in the sense that it took place exactly the way it says.
I gotcha. Yeah. Well, so as a side note, interesting thing that you might find interesting regarding those modes of exegesis, the Gospels appear to all 4 have been written pertaining to one of those modes. So keep that in the back of your head when you're reading the Gospels the next time, because you'll notice it. But yeah, as far as certain things not intending to actually be literal, I think I've mentioned, maybe not in one of my TikToks. I think I mentioned it in another interview. The Book of Job, for example, is viewed as poetry. It doesn't necessarily have to be literal. It's not to say it's not literal.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think Judaism would discount whether or not it's literal, but I don't think it matters a whole lot for them because they do read it as a poetic reading.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Bible Project.
Somewhat.
Okay. So on there, the main theologian guy is Dr. Tim Mackey, and he actually takes the stance that the Book of Job is a what's the word? Parable. So it's not to be taken as a literal story, but more of a parable, more of a like, hey, this is kind of the way things work kind of story, you know?
Yeah.
He takes that point of view, but you know, it's cool to see that that's not just something that he kind of pulled out of his butt. That it's this, you know, it's got a precedence in Judaism as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So what is the bare minimum that you think that a Christian should that a Christian needs to know about not only their faith but context, just the context of the Bible?
Ooh, what a question. Because it really depends on what, you know, which one of the books of the Bible you're talking about. So, you know, Paul Philip Levertov was an Orthodox Jew, grew up Orthodox Jewish, and he happened upon one of the Gospels, or a copy of the New Testament. I think first he happened upon a Gospel and read through it, and you know, found Jesus to be one of the most fantastic Hasidic Jews that ever lived. Like that's how he understood this guy. And then later found out that that's the Jesus that, you know, Judaism has abhorred for so many years. And he took it upon himself to read through the New Testament. And when he read through, you know, like Paul and John, what he surmised is that Christians do not know what they're reading because they don't have an education in the more mystical teachings of Judaism. So he wrote a book, or really a pamphlet, called Love in the Messianic Age, where he kind of expounds on the key to understanding John and Paul is Tanya. Tanya is a series of writings in Judaism that kind of they go a little bit into the more mystical teaching. And it's a 5-volume set intended to explain the portion of the Bible that says the commandment is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. So the fact that Jews can go on for 5 volumes to explain what that phrase actually means should tell you exactly how broad that is.
Right.
It's actually, I've got it on my shelf here. That would be the set.
I was going to ask you, how do you spell Tanya?
Tanya.
Tanya.
Yep.
Okay.
The copy that I've got, you can find on Cahote Publishing, or Cahote Online. And I can tell you personally, I remember reading through John and Paul before I had actually gone through that. It's a year-long study cycle. It reads almost like a Bible study that has, you know, okay, this date you read this reading, and this date you read this reading, right? So it'll last you a whole year. It starts at the Hanukkah. Like Hanukkah is when the cycle starts. And after spending a year studying it, I can tell you, like, my whole perspective on John and Paul has changed completely.
Cool. That's cool. So so if you could pull out one thing that shifted your perspective in the Tanya, what would it be?
The anatomy of the soul.
Okay.
They spend a good long while explaining the anatomy of the soul, the function of the soul, how it relates to God, how it either draws nearer or grows farther from Him via your relationship with God, and sinning or not sinning. and that really would be the entire first volume. It is a little monotonous. The first volume opens up with a question and then spends 13 chapters explaining and kind of deconstructing your worldview before it answers the question. So like you get to the 14th chapter and they answer the question and you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot there was a question.
So when you talk about anatomy of the soul, are you kind of so there's a joke in my office, because whenever somebody comes into my office, the first question I ask them, especially if they're kind of newer, I say, trichotomy or dichotomy. Like I just point at them and I ask them is that what it's talking about, anatomy of the soul, or is it something completely different and I just need to read the book?
Yeah, I would say probably just need to read the book.
Okay.
Now I will say some of it may fall completely on deaf ears. Admittedly, when I read through it, there's a large portion of it that went way over my head because it's written from the perspective that the reader already is familiar with certain concepts and certain understandings within deeper Judaism. Okay. So it's one of those that reads as though the reader already understands a lot of what is like written in the Midrash and in the Talmud and whatnot.
Kind of like the Bible.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right, man. So I want to get to your series on Matthew 5.
Okay.
Because it's really just questions. I'm not, trying to debate you or anything like that. It's just really questions. So I kind of titled it for you. I think you might have called it this too, but it's until all things are accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was kind of what I picked out. Really, I picked it out for the most part, and it was really the video that was on Matthew 5:18 that I want to talk about. Because you said that until the events of Revelation. So I wanted to ask you, what's your eschatology?
I would say my eschatology is most certainly post-trib.
Post-trib. Okay. Well, if we're talking about, let's talk about millennial reign.
Yeah. Okay. So the millennial reign is the event that we see beginning when you see the Son of Righteousness coming with the clouds. That's to usher in the millennial reign. That would pretty much be my eschatology on that.
Okay, so to clarify, so what I'm getting from you is that you're a premillennialist, so that you believe that the return of Jesus, not necessarily the second coming, but the return of Jesus is going to happen before the millennial reign, because so with most eschatology, it's broken up. You can break it up into premillennial, amillennial, and postmillennial, as far as millennial reigns go. Amillennials believe that we are living in the millennial reign, but that it's a heavenly millennial reign. So Jesus is reigning up in heaven right now, but he does not reign on earth. And the worldview I'm working with currently is a postmillennial worldview, which is we are living currently in the millennial reign of Jesus, but he reigns both on heaven and on earth. So I think that yours would be we are not living in that millennial reign.
Yeah, I wouldn't say so.
Okay.
For a few reasons, but
okay, go ahead, go into those reasons, because now it's just kind of free flow.
Well, one of the primary ones, and I don't know if I bring this up in the Matthew 5 set of videos or if I brought it up in my set of videos pertaining to Sukkot.
Well, I know your Matthew 5 video was more focused on should we, is it a kind of a Christian's duty to continue following the law or not?
Yeah.
I just picked out the eschatology portion of it.
Yeah. So I think it may be in that video that I mentioned it just kind of as here's a proof text, briefly, but there is a verse in Zechariah that specifically outlines that the nations, not just Israel, Israel will be a kingdom at this time, but that the nations will either observe the festival of Sukkot or they will not get rain. So that's an either or. You either observe the festival as God commands or you get drought. And that and also the prophecies concerning the new covenant in Jeremiah 31 are in a way predicated on things that have not yet come to pass.
Okay. Say that one more time.
The prophecies so the new covenant in Jeremiah 31 contains prophetic elements that Jews acknowledge as prophetic, that have not yet come to pass, which are things Judaism acknowledges will precede the messianic coming.
Okay. Yeah, I'd have to study up on that a little bit more. But one of the things that you said was Jesus accomplished part of what the Messiah was supposed to accomplish, but not all of it. What else was the Messiah supposed to accomplish?
So this is actually exactly what I was referencing to before. So when you read Jeremiah 31, starting in verse 31, and I think it goes through verse 34, God says, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Okay, so the precedence that we have is that God is acknowledging the divided kingdom, because Israel was a divided kingdom.
Right.
So he's saying that he'll make a covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So both of these divided kingdoms are included in this covenant, yet they are still divided. And then in like the next few verses, he says, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel in those days. That is an acknowledgement of the divided kingdom coming together, becoming whole again, of a unified Israel once more. So one of the missions of the son of David specifically would be that he would unify Israel, gather all of the Jews back to Israel as his subjects, and rule from there.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that not only are all Jews not in Israel, but also that the lost tribes are still lost, that kind of stands as a historical quirk in the idea that we're living in the post-millennial era.
Okay. Yeah. So the way I would view that is, and I was talking to you about me and my buddy Ken. We were kind of going over the divided kingdom. We were literally just going over this like not 2 Sundays ago, and we would ask the question, well, when did Jesus accomplish this, bringing the divided kingdom back together? You would say that he hasn't done that yet. I would argue almost that this was accomplished in Acts, when Peter is giving his message, and they're speaking in tongues and about that, and all of these people that are gathered together. It says right there in Acts, I think it's 2 or 3, that those people were Jews, and they were gathered in Jerusalem at that day, but they all spoke in different tongues, and all the tongues that they were speaking were different Gentile nation tongues, but that Peter was able to speak, or that they were hearing the gospel in their own native language, and so that's when Jesus kind of called together the kingdom back.
So,
and I'm not super versed in it, so I don't have the ability to argue it. It's just an interesting point that it's just funny that you're talking about that now.
Yeah, that's Acts chapter 2, and I would say, from the perspective, I would say that would make sense, but you do have to take into account the diaspora at this time.
Okay.
So the diaspora, there were Jews living abroad all over the world at this point. And because of that, I mean, obviously, the command is to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the highest of the holidays. There are 3 throughout the year, Pentecost being one of them. So this is why they would all have been in Jerusalem. And the miracle being that, obviously in Jerusalem, they all would have been speaking Hebrew naturally. But at this point, you've got, as far as they know, less educated men speaking, Chinese or whatever language the region of the world that they came from. Yeah.
It's an interesting point.
Absolutely.
Because I wrote that down, like the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But in my point of view, if the 10 lost tribes of Israel were kind of preached to at that moment, at that day, then that's Jesus accomplishing that, bringing the divided kingdom back together in Acts chapter 2.
I would say, given the caveat that none of them really know which tribe that they're from, and off the top of my head, I couldn't remember which verse says it, but there is a passage in the Bible that is, again, one of the Messiah's duties is to explain to everyone which tribe they belong to.
But so do you think that they would know that themselves, like even being spread out what tribe they're from?
So there are a few schools of thought. So within the Hebrew roots movement, the 10 tribes theology is actually very prominent. Now, none of them would know directly which tribe they come from. There are methods of historical research you can kind of make a good guess at. Like I think those who hail from, like, Scythian lineage have surmised that they may descend from the tribe of Dan, which there's even somewhat of a biblical precedence for at least acknowledging a Jewish heritage, because Paul, in another verse, again, I off the top of my head couldn't cite to you which one, but Paul is kind of comparing the good and the bad, and there's a certain part where he says barbarians or Scythians, and it's like, well, who are the Scythians? It's the only time in the Bible they're ever mentioned. And they're compared to barbarians, so they're obviously preferable to whoever the barbarians are. But also, I think there are even some people who think like that the Danish may descend from the tribe of Dan. Outside of that, I've never really heard any valid explanation as to what tribe people think they descend from. I know within the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, there are subsects that believe that all ethnicities except white Europeans represent the other 10 tribes.
Oh, well.
Right? It's one of those where it's like, how do you even come to that?
Oh, man. So another thing I want to talk to you about too is your explanation of Matthew. I think it's 15:19, or 5:19. Was it 5:19 or 15:19?
5:19.
Okay, so 5:19, and you talk about how, and this is kind of more of the law, following the law, because I had a ton of questions about like the law and about that, and it was just going to be more debatey than it was like me actually like asking questions. Because I watched your video about the sacrificial system and Jesus, did he come and nullify the sacrificial system? I found it super interesting. I found it very interesting, and I'd love to explore that a little bit more. But for me, it kind of brought up these questions about, as a Christian, should I follow the law or not? And you stated in your TikTok that it's not required for salvation to follow the law or not, but that they'll be seen as greater or lesser than in the kingdom of heaven. However, in Matthew 20, it says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, which we know that their righteousness wasn't very righteous at all, it says you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so for me, that kind of negates that statement.
So
it's seen as greater or lesser.
So there is something to that. So he says your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, this points out a few things. The first being that he acknowledges that the Pharisees do have a righteousness to speak of. Now, for their day, they actually were the most righteous as far as what could be observed. Okay. And there's another passage, and I want to say it's in Mark, where Jesus reprimands them for being so stringent as to tithe on their spices, but then withhold money from their parents if they're in need. And he accuses them of having uplifted the lesser matters, negated the weightier matters. The interesting thing to note about that is that he tells them that the weightier matters, they are what they should have done, and yet still not left the other undone. So he's saying, absolutely tithe your spices, but don't neglect what's really important there. The trouble that we see on on the issue of the Pharisees in Jesus' day, and this kind of goes into what I was saying earlier about how the Judaism that existed during Jesus' adult ministry is not the same as the Judaism that preceded it, or lived beyond it. It's kind of isolated within that 7-year time block. That those Pharisees did a lot for show. So outwardly, there were, as far as what could be observed, they were very righteous as far as the standards of the law, because the law is how you gauge righteousness, right? That's the idea. And but they did it for show rather than out of love for. When you get into this, what you're going to very quickly find out is that if you're not doing it because you mean it, it doesn't count. So having righteousness that exceeds that of the Pharisees is easily as simple as doing the law and meaning it.
Okay. For me, it kind of made me think of when in hold on a second, in Galatians 3, Paul talks about righteousness and the promise that was given to Abraham, and the law and the promises. And there was a point I wanted to make with it. I don't want to read the whole thing. Because it says all who rely on works of the law are under a curse, because it is written, everyone who does not do everything written in the book of the law is cursed. And that's kind of what you're saying.
Not really.
I
wouldn't say that I'm saying that. And so you got to understand the perspective Paul is writing from.
Okay.
So, in Romans 7, he explains that those who are under the law are subject to keep the whole law. So when you've got a new movement of Gentiles who are, green and fresh from the crop, so to speak, a lot of them at the time were actually attempting to convert to Judaism, because as far as they knew, that's how that worked, right? Paul is encouraging them not to undergo a full conversion to Judaism, because that actually would put their lives in danger. Because when you convert to Judaism, you are then subject to a Sanhedrin court. So, things like violating the Sabbath, that comes with a death penalty. And if you're not really fully aware of everything you're not supposed to be doing on the Sabbath, then an ignorant Gentile may very well make a mistake that would cost them their life in this time, if they were actually converted to Judaism. However, if they're not converted to Judaism, they're not subject to the Sanhedrin court. Therefore, they can observe as much as they're able, like Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. But they are not subject to any death penalties should they make a mistake.
Okay. I guess the point I was just trying to make more of in the Galatians was where it talks about in verse 11 that now it is clear that no one is justified before God by the law, because the righteous will live by faith. The one who does these things will live by them. But the law is not based on faith. Instead, the one who does these things will live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, blah, 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 blah. And then it talks about the purpose was that the blessing of Abraham would come to the Gentiles by Christ Jesus. So, of course, Galatians, he's talking to Gentiles, so that we could receive the promised Spirit through faith. So talking more on faith. He even talks about why was the law given. It was given for the sake of transgressions until the seed would come. And he talks about the law more of like this schoolmaster or this guardian. And then he makes the statement that we're no longer under the guardian.
Yeah. And so I'm not disagreeing with anything that Paul is saying there. I absolutely would say, the same as Abraham, and Jews have throughout time always said that, righteousness is by faith. The same way it was imputed to Abraham. I even think in my video, in our video about the sacrifices, that we read through a portion of Judaic commentary from the Chumash, that actually outlines that they fully understand that before getting into the sacrifices. So it's kind of shapes your mind before you start reading about the sacrifices, that they fully acknowledge that righteousness is only by faith. As far as being under the law and being subject to the law, those are not the same thing, though. As far as the curse of the law, I mean, the law that's not to say that the law in itself is a curse. The curse of the law is the curse that comes with breaking it. That would be like, so the curse of modern day traffic laws is that you get a speeding ticket if you exceed the speed limit. But, Jesus being a good attorney and, buddy who posted your bail for you and took the points on his driver's license for you and, paid your court fees, him having done that does not negate the speed limit.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I guess I still I guess I want more clarification on what you're talking about, subject to the law, and then what was the other term?
Under the law.
Under the law. Okay.
Yeah. See, when I have exceeded the speed limit and I receive a citation for having exceeded the speed limit, and now I am due to go to court. At that point, I'm under the law. If I am traveling the speed limit, I am subject to the law.
Okay. Yeah, I'd have to look at that more.
So one of the easier ways to kind of break that whole idea down is this. Like, what do you think the biblical definition of sin would be? If you could single out a verse or a philosophy that like defines sin in dictionary fashion, what would it be?
I mean, I'm sure you've heard the whole hamartia, where it's missing the mark. You're missing the mark of God.
So that is a Jewish concept. The Hebrew word for sin actually does mean exactly that. That's what it means. Is
right.
But biblically, yeah, go.
Well, I would say I guess because in one of your videos you said this, and I agree with it, as well. But without knowing the law, you don't know, if you're sinning or not. So you have to have it's transgressing against that. It's transgressing against that law. Yeah.
So, and that's I would say the Bible agrees with that. So 1 John 3:4 is kind of where we see a dictionary definition. John says, he who sins transgresses the law, because sin is the transgression of the law. So if we take the law for what John describes it as, it's the metric by which we discern what is and isn't sin. And what would you say the opposite of sin is?
Not sin. Yeah, I mean, man, you caught me off guard. I guess I would say righteousness, right standing with God.
When you're doing actions that God Himself would be doing, when you're giving in charity and things like that, that is acting like God in the moment, So yeah, that would be righteous for sure. But again, it only truly is righteous if it's coming from a heart of love for God. It's one of those where I'm going to go hand $1,000 to some homeless guy and I'm going to film it the whole time. Right. That's, now I'm not doing it for the right reasons. Now I'm doing it so everybody pats me on the back for it. That's that I would say is where the difference is.
Yeah. I guess it just comes with the concern of people becoming another Pharisee kind of thing, where they want to try to do the letter of the law to the point where they kind of over emphasize the law, instead of because I do believe that faith without works is dead. Like if you're not showing that you have the faith that you say you have, then you don't have the faith you say you have. So I agree with that. And then how would you know that you're doing those works? Well, you'd have to have some kind of standard to set it by. I guess it's just that fear that you're putting people back under the law, as in you're putting them back under that weight. You're putting a heavy burden on them that they can't carry. I think that's the concern.
Yeah, I guess my only trouble with that is that, this is the same burden that that Jesus himself carried, and he said his burden is easy and his yoke is light. And it's one of those that if you are a believer, I would say you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you, and that's actually the direct context that Paul is using those words in. He's explaining that these things are not too hard. 1 John 5:3. By this we know that you love the brethren, that you love God and keep His commandments, because His commandments are not grievous. Moses himself, again, the whole of Tanya is built on where Moses says, this commandment is not too far away, which so as to say it's not too hard.
Right.
It's very near to you in your mouth and in your heart that you may do it. Now what I think you'd find fascinating, and again, I couldn't summarize it here, but the distinction between, in your mouth and in your heart that you may do it. That's really kind of what that's another one of the things that Tanya hits really heavy on why the difference between all of those and how that looks in practice. And that's why earlier I used the example of charity, is because the Hebrew word for charity is tzedakah. Coincidentally, it's also the word for righteousness. That's as far as Jews are concerned, that is one of the most righteous things you can do, is to be charitable to another person.
Wow. That's cool, man. Well, if you have time, there's a couple things that were said in the comment section, not the pizza talk. Unless you want to talk about pizza, we can talk about pizza.
I love pizza.
No, but it's this one right here. So this is my buddy Adam Graham. Me and him actually talked about Zionism on a couple of episodes, so you might find that interesting that we talked about that. But he says, at the same time, we interpret the Old Testament in the light of the new, i.e. progressive revelation. What are your kind of thoughts on that? Because just from the way I'm hearing it, I would almost think you would disagree.
Yeah. Progressive revelation is, I don't typically subscribe to the idea of modern day prophets. It's one of those things that I don't really see a precedence for, even in the New Testament, outside of its particular context. But for me, really, the Bible, certainly the New Testament can shed light on certain things in the Old, and in as much as some of them are more detailed. Or even I've used this example before as well in one of my TikToks, but in the book of Jude, Michael the archangel and Satan dispute over Moses' body. In Hebrews, we read an entire account of Moses and his life that you'll never find in Exodus. These are things that are not in the Old Testament, but they inform on the Old Testament. They're actually taken from the Jewish Midrash, which is based on that word darush that I explained earlier from the four forms of exegesis. Midrash Rabbah is kind of like it's telling the story that we're not given in the biblical account, because the biblical account has a purpose,
right?
And so within that, there are other parts of the story that we're not necessarily told, and it's not necessarily viewed as, even in Judaism, as being divinely inspired, but nonetheless historically accurate. And so there's questions like, well, why did God choose Abraham? I mean, really, why? It's kind of random and happens out of nowhere, but the account of Abraham and the fact that he destroyed the idols that his father made, because as the story goes in Midrash, his father was an idol maker, which he couldn't abide, because he could look at creation and observe that only one great God could have done this. And so he destroyed the idols and whatnot. And that proved to God that this was someone who was worthy of his promise. And, so it's stuff like that, that the New Testament actually does influence on. Paul uses a lot of Midrash, in his writings, but, as far as for me, the entire whole of the Bible really is a repeat of Genesis and Exodus, thematically speaking. The Bible is full of thematic repetition. And what I tend to see, at least as far as I read in the Bible, is that the narratives of Genesis and Exodus are just copied and pasted over and over again with different elements to the story.
I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah. And then this, and it's the same. It's Adam still. He put, one law theology. I don't know. I don't know what one law theology is. I can assume what it means. Can you kind of shed light on one law theology?
I don't know that I've ever heard it characterized as that, but if I had to guess, I would say that it is. It's an attempt to describe what I believe, which is that there is one law for all of God's people. You know, if you consider yourself a subject of God's kingdom, then God's kingdom has laws. Or if you consider yourself, part of God's family, as the Bible would account for it, the Jews are His natural born children, and Gentiles who are now grafted in, as we read in Romans 11, Ephesians 2. Are the adopted children. You wouldn't have a separate set of rules for your natural children and your adopted children. You would, you would have the same house rules for them all. So yeah, that would be the one law. Whereas, as I indicated earlier, Christianity is predicated mostly on the idea that there was the law back then, but that's not for us today. Or some schools of thought are that those laws are for the Jews and they're still for the Jews, but they're not for Gentiles, and
right.
So on and so forth.
Yeah. Cool, man. Well, that's pretty much all I have.
Hey, man, that's good. It was a good discussion. It's those good questions, man.
Sweet, man. Sweet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of wrap up real quick. I'm going to ask you to stick around and we'll do some post-show talk and everything like that. So just give me 1 second. Anything you want to plug?
You can look for me on TikTok. I enjoy,
right now you're
talking to people. Yeah. But no, I guess my YouTube channel, Altarnate Media, spelled like you see it here. Send us questions, post comments. We love that. That gives us ideas for new content. We actually just the other night filmed in preparation for the holiday season, the same way we did a pastor Easter kind of comparison episode. We have recently done an episode kind of weighing out Hanukkah and Christmas.
Yeah.
And so that'll be an interesting one.
Bro, if you did a series on these 4 forms of Jewish exegesis, that would be amazing.
We've thought about that. There are certain things. So killing the church has a purpose, and so we're kind of trying to stick to the purpose of killing the church. There are other things where we've had discussions of branching out and doing, and maybe making some of it exclusive. We've talked about getting a Patreon going, because eventually he and I want to do this for a living. I mean, I'm a mechanic / service writer right now. I would really love. This is what I love doing. So I would love to be able to make a living doing it. But killing the church is our free service, and maybe a couple of other podcasts, a weekly Torah study we'll probably do as a free service. But there are some other ones like that that we've talked over doing in greater detail, and using that as exclusive content.
Cool, man. All right, well, stick around for me a little bit and we'll do like a little post-show thing. All right. So everybody, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation that I had today with Brad. Altarnate Media is on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. Brad and his colleague Seamus are also on TikTok with their own respective accounts. All that information, I'm going to post that in the description. All that info is going to be there. You can rewatch this stream on my YouTube page. The link is in my bio, whatever you're watching, Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, whatever. The link is in my bio. I have all my links thing. You can find my YouTube page there, or you can also find my Twitch page there as well. Or you can listen on podcasts available on Google Podcasts and Apple Podcasts and most other podcast providers that you would probably use. I hope to see you next week as we explore next time as we explore more Matt News.